check one, two. Okay, so this is just a quick set of recall notes for this input system tutorial by BiteMeGames. It's easy to find, but there's the URL. So anyway, swapping over to Unity, what we've got here is just a simple ball player, and it responds to WASD to move around, and then F fires just logs a fire event. So the way this is set up is with the new input action. So let me just make sure I have my terminology correct. So we have these two sets of input actions. This is the default one, and you'll see it's fully populated with a bunch of stuff. In the tutorial, he walks you through creating your own. And when you create your own, I'll look at this in a second, but when you create your own, you also add to the player this player input, and this actions is your new custom input action. So let's look at this. There's a control scheme called gameplay. Wait, let me think about this. Sorry. There's a control scheme called keyboard. There's an action map called gameplay. So you can, let me see, add control scheme, new control scheme name, keyboard 2, and you basically just say what is required. You're requiring a keyboard, and you save that. So for XR, you would do a scheme named XR or Shimi's XR or whatever, and add. I haven't really done this, so I don't really know how this works, but you get your XR controllers, or you get your XR HMD, and that's basically saying in this control scheme what devices are required. So once we have that, we create an action map called gameplay, and the way this is useful is like if you're walking through an environment, you can have one gameplay, right? So like teleporting an XR or whatever, grabbing stuff, and then if you enter a car, you can have a second gameplay where like the joystick trigger on the controller drives the car or something like that. You can have separate gameplays. And then actions, you basically add, if you're not using the default one, you add your custom actions. And fire's an easy one. It's just a button, and then what you do is you add a binding, and the way you do that. So like if I wanted to bind this also to, let me see if I can add a binding path listen. If I wanted to bind this to spacebar. So now fire is both bound to the F key and to the spacebar. And I'm going to just use listen and hit the key on the keyboard. So that's a button. And then movement is a 2D vector. So this is of type pass-through. I'm not 100% clear on what the difference between value and pass-through is. But here we want pass-through of a vector. And you add a binding. And in this case, what I added was add this default up, down, left, right composite binding. So this is forward, back, left, right, and it adds up, down, left, right, and you just bind it to the WS, A, and D keys. So that's how you set up this sort of custom input actions object. And you can do this by create input actions. So I could create a whole new one. And then, like I said, you add it to the player input so that it's sitting there listening to actions. And then the second thing I've got is this this player movement script, which is also added to the sphere. But player movement basically just has even before Rider opens. Oh, I don't want this. Sorry, I wish I could pause this recording, but it's Unity file. Let's see. Settings, external tools, rider. Let's see if that worked. Player movement script. Trusted open, allow. Okay, you can see on this very basic player movement script, I've got a public input action reference, one called move and one called fire. So what that's basically doing is on the sphere in that script, I've got these two input action references. And the way that you find that is Shimi's input actions, and then there's gameplay fire. That's the one we set up with the button, and that's the one we set up with move. So you basically just drag those onto those public references here. And then in the script, you can call, well, the first thing you need to call, which is not in the tutorial, and this was broken based on just the tutorial content, is you need to enable them in onEnable. And the fire is pretty easy. Basically, you queue up a function. So this function, you bind it to, I'm not sure what the options are here. Probably get not installed. Are we still loading this? I'm not going to worry about that, but we're binding to the start. There's probably a finished, and there's probably a down and an up or whatever, stuff like that. But right now we're adding this function fire callback to started. We're enabling it. On disable we're removing fire. On enable we're adding fire. And then for the movement, we're simply saying that this custom vector, which is move direction, this private vector 2, we're getting the value of that sort of 2D pad, that XY pad that's related to the forward and left right action. So that's either going to be 1 or -1 in the x-axis, or 1 or -1 in the y-axis. And then simply in fixed update, I'm kind of a newbie to Unity. I'm not exactly sure how this rigid body really works, but we're basically adding, it's sort of like a typical move thing where we're adding the move direction times speed and the move direction y times speed, and that's just hung off of this rigid body attached to the player, and that's basically it. So the theory is that when you go into an XR project, there's not going to be an input action set of input actions set up by default, but you should be able to set them up, and then you have lower level access to things like head movement and controller movement. So if you want to do a walking script or whatever based on head bob, you can read head bob without latency, as opposed to, like, if you imagine the XR rig tree grabbing the camera object and looking at the transform to look at head motion. So that's a higher latency version. If we want lower latency, you go through the input system.